The woman didn't even flinch. That was what made Martha Greer's words so cruel. She had leaned across the mercantile counter, loud enough for every soul in Ridge Hollow to hear, and said it with a smile on her face. A woman that age chasing after a boy who hasn't even grown into his boots yet? Honey, that's not love. That's desperation wearing a dress. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the quiet, knowing kind. The kind that settles into a room and stays there long after the people leave. Vivian Ashcroft stood 3 feet away and heard every word. She picked up her flour, counted her coins onto the counter, and walked out that door without a single tremor in her hands. But her hands were trembling. Elias Harper saw them. And in that moment, something in him went very, very still. If you've ever loved someone the wrong way, the wrong age, the wrong time, the wrong everything, according to everyone else around you, then stay right here, because this story is going to feel like something you've lived before. And if you haven't, stay anyway, because you need to understand what real courage looks like when it's wearing work boots and a schoolteacher's coat. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when the world told them not to. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Last week someone commented from a small town in New Zealand and it moved me more than I can say. Hit that like button too, because it tells us to keep going. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The road into Ridge Hollow, Wyoming, was not kind to wagons. It never had been. The ruts ran deep enough in some places to swallow a wheel past the axle, and the particular stretch just past Callaway Creek had a way of catching travelers off guard. The ground looked solid until it wasn't, and by then the front wheel was already canted sideways, and your mules were pulling in 3 different directions. Elias Harper had lost count of how many times he'd helped pull some poor soul out of that same stretch. Merchants, mostly. Families coming in from Laramie or further east, their wagons packed too heavy with furniture and hope. He'd learned to slow his horse when he came around that bend, not because he was looking to be helpful, but because a spooked mule in a ditch could take a man's leg off if you rode past too fast. That particular Tuesday morning in late September, he came around the bend and stopped entirely. The wagon was well and truly stuck. The left front wheel had gone in almost to the hub, and the mules, 2 dusty gray animals with the resigned expressions of creatures who had seen this happen before, were standing perfectly still, as if they'd decided collectively that the situation called for patience rather than panic. What stopped Elias wasn't the wagon. It was the woman standing beside it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't flagging him down, arms waving, the way most people did when they found themselves in a fix on a dirt road 12 miles from the nearest town. She was standing in the mud with her boots already dark past the ankle, studying the wheel the way a carpenter studies a warped board, not with frustration, but with the focused quiet of someone who is already 3 steps into solving the problem. She had a piece of rope in her hands. She was measuring something, looking from the rope to the wheel to the mules, and her lips were moving slightly, like she was doing arithmetic. Elias sat on his horse for a moment longer than was polite. She was older than him. He could see that plainly. Not old, that wasn't the word, and it wasn't what he meant. But there were lines at the corners of her eyes and a certain steadiness in the way she held herself that didn't come from youth. She wore her dark hair pulled back severely, and her coat was good quality but worn at the cuffs, and everything about her said, "I have been taking care of myself for a very long time, and I am not about to stop now." He climbed down from his horse anyway. "Morning," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were gray, the particular gray of sky before snow, and they assessed him in about 2 seconds flat. "Morning," she said back, and then returned her attention to the wheel. He stood there for a moment, his hat in his hands. "Looks like you've got yourself a situation." "I've got it handled," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at the wheel. He looked at the rope she was holding. He looked at the angle the mules were standing, which was not the angle that was going to help anything. "You plan to tie that rope to the axle and run it back around the trace chain?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "It won't hold. Axles would. It'll splinter before the wheel moves a full quarter turn." She looked at the rope. She looked at the axle. Her jaw tightened in a way that told him she had already half figured this out herself and was not pleased that a stranger had confirmed it. The hitch, he said. If you run it from the hitch, back around both single trees together, and then loop it forward to the wheel rim, the iron part, not the spoke, and then have both mules pull straight forward instead of angled, the leverage will be different. The wheel should come free. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time. You've done this before, she said. 14 times on this same stretch of road, he said, give or take. Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was more like the recalibration a person makes when they realize they've been handed genuinely useful information from a genuinely competent source. She didn't smile, but she didn't dismiss him either. Show me, she said. He showed her. 20 minutes later, the wheel came free with a sucking sound, and the mules lurched forward and the wagon rolled out of the rut onto solid ground. The woman stood with mud up to her shins and her coat askew, and she looked at the freed wheel with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and exhaustion, and Elias thought that was probably one of the most honest faces he'd seen in a long time. Thank you, she said, not grudgingly, but carefully, like the words were being measured before she let them out. Elias Harper, he said, Vivian Ashcroft. She extended her hand, which was muddy, and he shook it without hesitation, which was muddy too. I'm the new school teacher for the Ridge Hollow School. I know, he said. We've been expecting you since August. Something flickered behind her eyes. I had some difficulty with the previous situation. He didn't ask what the previous situation was. He could see from the way she said it that the previous situation was a door she had locked and wasn't planning to open for strangers on muddy roads. Well, he said instead, Ridge Hollow's been waiting on a teacher for going on 2 years. The children will be glad you're here. How many students? 11 last count, ages 6 through 15. Bobby Whitfield's 15 and meaner than a wet cat, so I'd watch that one. A corner of her mouth moved, the very, very corner. I've handled worse, she said. He believed her. He rode alongside the wagon the rest of the way into town, not because she asked him to, but because the road did 2 more nasty things before it straightened out, and he figured the information was worth more than the awkwardness of the offer. She didn't tell him to go away. She didn't make conversation either. She sat straight on that wagon seat with her eyes on the road and handled those mules with the quiet competence of someone who'd been doing it alone for years. And Elias found himself noticing small things. The way she shifted her grip on the reins when the road tilted, the slight forward lean she made before a rough patch, the way she never once grabbed the seat for balance even when the wagon lurched. She had lived a physical life. Whatever the previous situation had been, she'd come out of it knowing how to manage her own body in hard circumstances. He didn't say any of this. He rode alongside and answered the 2 questions she asked. Where was the schoolhouse? And where was the nearest place to stable the mules? And when they reached Main Street and she could see everything for herself, he touched the brim of his hat and said it was good to meet her. And you, she said. And that was it. He rode away thinking that was the most interesting person he'd met in Ridge Hollow in 3 years, possibly longer, and feeling vaguely unsettled by the thought in a way he couldn't quite account for. Ridge Hollow was not a cruel town. That is important to say, because what happened next was not cruelty exactly. It was something more familiar and in some ways more dangerous. It was smallness. The particular smallness of people who have lived in one place long enough that anything new starts to look like a threat. Vivian Ashcroft arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday morning, the Mercantile had already generated 3 separate theories about her. The first theory, floated by Pete Greer, who ran the hardware store, was that she must have been dismissed from her last post for improper behavior, because why else would a woman her age be traveling alone to a frontier town? The second theory, which belonged to his wife Martha, and was considered far more reliable because Martha had actually spoken to Vivian in the Mercantile, was that she was running from something. A husband, probably. Maybe a dead one, maybe a live one, but either way something had gone wrong somewhere, and she'd landed in Ridge Hollow the way a bird lands on a branch. Not because it's the branch they wanted, but because their wings gave out. The third theory was barely a theory. It was more of an undercurrent, something that moved through conversation the way cold air moves under a door. You don't see it, but you feel it. It was simply the awareness that the new school teacher was 41 years old and traveling alone and had no husband anyone could identify, and that those 3 facts in combination meant something. Exactly what it meant was never said out loud. It didn't need to be. Vivian was aware of all of it within her first week. She had lived long enough in small places to read the temperature of a room when she walked in, to see the conversations that paused and the eyes that moved over her in assessment. She didn't respond to any of it. She opened the schoolhouse, swept it out, made a list of supplies she needed, and had 11 children in their seats by Monday morning. What she did in that classroom was immediate and total. She taught with a seriousness that the children responded to first with wariness, and then with something approaching respect, including Bobby Whitfield, who tried twice to undermine her authority in the first week and found on both occasions that he was outmaneuvered so cleanly and so quietly that he almost didn't realize it had happened. He came home the second Friday and told his mother the teacher was different from the other ones. His mother, who was one of the women who had been whispering, was briefly silenced. Elias heard about the classroom the way you hear about things in small towns, in pieces, from different people, on different days. The blacksmith's daughter came home reciting something Vivian had taught them about rivers. The pastor's son, who'd been marked as a lost cause academically, read a complete sentence aloud for the first time. Little pieces of evidence, accumulating. He didn't see Vivian again until the second Saturday when he was coming out of the feed store and she was going in. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Harper." She stopped. There was a quality to the way she stopped that suggested she had somewhere to be and had chosen to pause anyway, which was its own kind of courtesy. "The road was better this week. I took the longer way around." "Smart," he said. "The rains are coming. Another month and that creek crossing will be underwater till spring." "So I've been told." She looked at him with those gray eyes, direct and measuring. "You're the one who fixed the schoolhouse roof last week." It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment. Someone had told her, apparently, or she'd found out some other way. He hadn't thought about that. He'd gone up on Thursday afternoon when he knew she'd be teaching, done what needed doing, and left. "It was leaking," he said. "I know what it was doing," she said. "I was inside when it rained." A pause. "I could have arranged for it to be repaired." "I know," he said. "Then why did you—" "Because I had the materials and the afternoon," he said, "and because 11 children sitting in a puddle isn't good for anybody." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. It was the kind of look a person gives when they're trying to figure out which category something belongs to. What kind of man does this kind of thing? And why? And what does he want in return? He could see the calculation happening, and he didn't blame her for it. He'd met enough people who did things in order to be owed something. "I'll pay for the materials," she said. "You don't need to." "I want to." He understood then that this mattered to her. Not as stubbornness, but as something more fundamental, keeping the balance clear, knowing exactly what she owed and to whom, because owing things to people was how you ended up vulnerable to them. "All right," he said. "Lumber cost me 40 cents. She reached into her coat pocket and produced 40 cents and put them in his palm with the precise movements of a person settling a debt. "Thank you," she said, "both for the roof and for letting her pay for it." He pocketed the coins. "Kids doing well in school?" Something changed in her face then. Not a smile, but the suggestion of one, a kind of interior warmth that showed up at the edges of things. "Bobby Whitfield read an entire page yesterday without stopping," she said. "Lord have mercy," Elias said, genuinely. This time she did smile. Just for a second, just a small one, but it was completely real and completely unlike any of the managed expressions she'd given him before, and it hit him somewhere unexpected. She said goodbye and went into the feed store. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than he needed to, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. The first direct confrontation came not from a man but from a woman, which was how these things usually went. It was the third week of October, and the evenings were getting cold in the specific way Wyoming evenings get cold, suddenly and completely, as if someone had reached up and turned off the sun like a lamp. Elias had come into town for supplies and had stopped at the post office and was on his way back when he saw Martha Greer stepping out of the mercantile right behind Vivian. "I'm just saying," Martha was saying loudly, to no one in particular, which meant to everyone within earshot, "It's a little strange, don't you think? A woman her age, no family, no history, anyone knows. She shows up, and within 3 weeks the Harper boy is fixing her roof and riding alongside her wagon." Vivian stopped walking. She turned around. Martha had not expected that. She'd expected what women in her position usually got: the dignified pretense that the comment hadn't been heard, the lifted chin, and the quickened step. Instead, Vivian was looking directly at her with those gray eyes that didn't perform anything. "His name is Elias Harper," Vivian said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "He's 27 years old, he runs his family's ranch, and he repaired a leaking roof because children were sitting in water. If you have a concern about that, I'd be glad to hear it directly." Martha's chin came up. "I just think it's unusual." "What specifically do you find unusual?" A pause. The people nearby had gone very still in the way people do when they're trying to seem like they're not paying attention while paying extremely close attention. "You're old enough to be his mother," Martha said. And there it was, out in the open, where it had been all along. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm his neighbor's new school teacher. What I am old enough to be is not a relevant category." She turned and walked away. Martha watched her go. She turned to the small audience that had accumulated and said, in the satisfied tone of someone who has proven a point, she didn't deny it. Elias had been standing at the corner the whole time. He had come around from the direction of the post office and stopped when he heard his name and then stood there while the whole thing played out, feeling something cold and tight in his chest that he recognized eventually as anger. He looked at Martha Greer. Martha saw him seeing her and had the decency to look briefly uncertain. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse for Vivian. He walked past Martha without speaking, which in Ridge Hollow was its own kind of statement, and he knew it would be noted and filed away and added to whatever case was being quietly constructed against the two of them for the terrible crime of having repaired a roof together. That night he sat on his porch in the dark and thought about it for a long time. He thought about Vivian's hands on the reins, competent and alone. He thought about the 40 cents laid precisely in his palm. He thought about the way she'd turned around and faced Martha Greer with nothing but the exact truth, which was somehow more devastating than any argument she could have made. He thought about the fact that he had known for about 2 weeks now that he was going to do something foolish, and he was still trying to figure out whether the foolishness outweighed what he actually felt. It didn't. He could already tell it didn't, but he wasn't going to do anything fast. Fast was how you spooked someone who was already watching all the doors. The first frost came 3 days later, hard and early, and covered the valley in white. And somewhere in the town, Vivian Ashcroft was sleeping alone in the small room above the schoolhouse that constituted her entire world. And Elias Harper was looking at the frost on his fence posts and thinking that winter was going to be very long indeed, and that some things were worth the waiting. He just had to convince her of the same. The frost that came in late October didn't leave. That was the thing about Wyoming winters. They didn't ease in gradually the way people from softer climates imagined. They arrived like an uninvited relative who immediately rearranged the furniture. One morning the ground was cold but manageable, and 3 days later it was iron, and everything you'd planned to finish before winter had to be abandoned where it stood. Elias finished winterizing his barn and his fences and his water troughs, and then, without quite deciding to, he found himself thinking about the schoolhouse. The roof he'd already handled, but roofs were only part of it. The building sat on the north side of Main Street and caught wind off the open plain in a way that the other buildings didn't, and the door had a gap at the bottom he'd noticed when he'd been up on the roof. Wide enough that come January, the cold coming through that gap would make the room nearly unbearable for small children sitting still for hours at a stretch. He told himself he was going because of the children. He went on a Thursday again, early morning before school started, with a strip of leather and a handful of tacks and a hammer. He was on his knees at the base of the door when he heard boots on the steps behind him. "You're here early," Vivian said. He hadn't heard her coming. He looked up and she was standing 3 feet away with 2 tin cups of something hot, and she held one out toward him with the straightforward practicality of someone who has decided a thing and is doing it. He took the cup. It was coffee, strong and slightly bitter, clearly made without much concern for the finer points of the process. "Door's got a gap," he said. "Cold'll come through bad by January." She looked at the gap. Then she looked at the leather strip in his hand. Then she sat down on the top step, not perching, not posing, just sitting the way tired people sit, and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "How long does winter last here?" she said. Not quite a question. "The bad part? December through February, sometimes into March." He went back to work with the tacks. "You've had cold winters before." Not like this. I came from Ohio originally, then St. Louis, then a town in Kansas that I'd rather not talk about. She said the last part without drama, just matter of fact, the way you'd describe a road that washed out. I've seen cold. I haven't seen this kind of isolation. He understood what she meant. Cold was one thing. Cold, combined with being completely surrounded by people who had already made up their minds about you, was something else entirely. Isolation gets easier, he said. Does it? No, he admitted. But you get better at it. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. He finished the leather strip and stood up and tested the door, and the gap was gone. He drank the rest of his coffee and handed back the cup, and she took it without ceremony. I heard what you did, she said, with Martha Greer, walking past her. I didn't do anything. That was the point. She looked up at him with those level gray eyes. People noticed. He didn't know what to say to that, so he picked up his hammer and his remaining tacks and put them back in his coat pocket. Kids will be coming soon, he said. Yes. She stood up. Mr. Harper. Elias. A pause, brief but real. Elias. I want you to understand something. I appreciate what you do. I'm not unaware of it, and I'm not ungrateful. But I need you to also understand that I have been the subject of people's interpretations before, and it did not end well, and I am not in a position to... She stopped, started again. I am not easy to know. I know that, he said. I mean it more than you think I mean it. I know that too. She studied him for a moment. He had the feeling she was looking for something dishonest, some tell, some crack in the surface where the real motive was hiding. He just stood there and let her look. All right, she said finally, and went inside. He walked back to his horse and rode home and spent the whole ride back trying to figure out what all right meant, and came up with nothing definitive, and decided that was probably as good a start as he was going to get. The gossip, meanwhile, had not rested. Martha Greer was not a stupid woman, which made her more dangerous than a stupid one would have been. She understood that the direct approach had failed. Vivian had turned it around on her cleanly, and Martha knew it, so she shifted to the slower method, which was the careful cultivation of doubt. She didn't say things outright anymore. She asked questions. Isn't it a little strange? Doesn't it seem like? Have you noticed how he always seems to know where she is? Questions were better than statements because they couldn't be directly refuted, and they planted themselves in people's minds and grew in the dark. By the first week of November, there were 2 distinct camps forming in Ridge Hollow, and most people hadn't consciously chosen a side but were drifting toward one anyway by the simple gravity of who they spent time with. The Greer camp, Pete and Martha, and 3 or 4 families who were socially adjacent to them, had settled into a position of concerned watchfulness. The other camp, smaller and less organized, was made up mostly of people whose children were in Vivian's classroom, and who were watching what was happening there with something that looked a lot like relief. Because what was happening in that classroom was undeniable. Bobby Whitfield, who had spent 2 years being quietly written off by everyone including himself, was reading. Not just sentences, full pages, and then coming back the next day with questions about what he'd read. The pastor's son had gone from a child who flinched when called on to one who raised his hand before the question was finished. The younger children were learning arithmetic the way Vivian taught everything, practically, with real objects and real problems, not just numbers on a slate that had no meaning attached to them. She was not a soft teacher. She didn't fill children with false praise or let wrong answers slide by with a gentle correction. If you were wrong, she said so, and then she made you figure out why. And that process was harder than being told the answer, but it lodged itself somewhere in the children's minds in a way that didn't come loose. A couple of the parents found this uncomfortable at first. One father came in and said his daughter had come home in tears because the teacher had made her redo a problem 4 times. Vivian looked at the man steadily and said, "She got it right on the 4th try. Ask her to explain rivers to you tonight." The man left. That evening his daughter explained in accurate detail how rivers cut through rock over centuries and changed the shape of the land. He came back to the schoolhouse the following morning and said he didn't have anything particular to say. He just wanted to make sure things were going all right, and Vivian understood that for what it was, a man's awkward way of withdrawing an objection. Elias heard this story from the blacksmith, who'd heard it from the father himself, and he felt something warm and uncomplicated settle in his chest. He was careful, though. He was deliberate about the careful. He had told himself he wouldn't spook her, and he meant it, and so the things he did he tried to do with a certain invisibility. Not so invisible that they didn't register because he wasn't playing games, but invisible enough that she could receive them without feeling cornered. The leather on the door. The time he spent an hour clearing the path from the schoolhouse to the pump when it iced over, knowing she'd have to carry water for the children. The afternoon he spent at the livery talking to old Cal Hennessy about the price of boarding her mules through winter, and the arrangement they eventually came to that would save her $4 a month, which Cal would present as a general winter boarding discount that he was offering everyone. That last one Vivian probably figured out. She was too sharp not to. But she didn't say anything, and he thought maybe that was its own kind of answer. What he didn't account for was Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed was 34, widowed 2 years, owned the largest general store in town, and had been looking at Vivian Ashcroft with undisguised interest since approximately the second week of her arrival. He was not a bad man. Elias had known him since boyhood and couldn't honestly say anything against his character. But he was a man who was used to getting what he wanted in Ridge Hollow, partly because of money, and partly because of the particular confidence that comes from being exactly the thing a community considers appropriate. He was the right age. He was established. He was a widower with 2 children who needed a mother, which in the social mathematics of the frontier made him a logical candidate for the attention of an unmarried schoolteacher. He started stopping by the schoolhouse after hours. Elias found out about this from Bobby Whitfield, of all people, who mentioned it with the casual observation that Mr. Reed had been around a lot lately, and that Miss Ashcroft always looked like she'd rather be doing something else when he was there, but that she was too polite to say so. Elias sat with that information for 2 days. He didn't own her time. He didn't have any claim on her in any form that either of them had spoken out loud. And Thomas Reed wasn't doing anything wrong by talking to a woman who was available to be talked to. But Bobby Whitfield had said she looked like she'd rather be doing something else. On the 3rd day, Elias rode into town on an errand that wasn't entirely an errand and managed to arrive at the schoolhouse at the same time Thomas Reed was leaving it. Thomas gave him a long look that contained a significant amount of assessment. Elias gave him the same look back. "Harper," Thomas said. "Reed," Elias said. Neither of them said anything else. Thomas walked away toward his store, and Elias knocked on the schoolhouse door, and Vivian opened it and looked at him with the expression of someone who is not surprised by the timing and is deciding how to feel about that. "Come to fix something?" she said. "Window latch on the south side is loose," he said. It was. He'd noticed it 2 weeks ago and left it, without quite admitting to himself why. She stepped back and let him in. The room smelled like chalk and the faint sweetness of the dried apples she kept on her desk for the younger students. He went to the window and looked at the latch, and it was indeed loose, and he pulled out his pocket knife and tightened the screws and tested it, and it held. "He's not going to stop coming by," Vivian said from behind him. Elias turned around. She was standing with her arms folded, not defensively, but in the way of a woman settling in for a frank conversation. "Reed," he said. "Yes." She looked at him evenly. "He's persistent. He's also not... There's nothing wrong with him. He's a decent man." "He is," Elias said, because it was true. "He's the right kind of man for a school teacher in a town like this," she said. "That's what people would say." "What do you say?" She was quiet for a moment. "I say that he looks at me the way a man looks at a problem he's decided to solve. And I have been somebody's solution before, and it didn't..." She stopped. She had a habit of stopping just before the thing that would tell you too much. "It didn't end well." "The Kansas situation," Elias said. Something shifted in her face. Not quite surprise. More like the slight rebalancing of someone who had expected to be the only one keeping track. "The Kansas situation," she confirmed. And then, after a long pause, in a voice that was completely level but cost her something. "I was married for 4 years. He was a school board member who thought a teacher wife was an asset until I started having opinions about things that weren't his to manage. When I left, he made sure the entire town knew why. His version of why, before I was across the county line." Elias was quiet. He understood now about the careful distances, the 40 cents, the way she turned and faced Martha Greer head-on rather than retreating. "You don't develop armor like that without having needed it. You don't have to explain anything to me," he said. "I know I don't." Her chin lifted slightly. I'm choosing to. He understood that was also something. He nodded once. Thomas Reed isn't him, he said. But I hear you. Do you? She was looking at him with those direct gray eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she was about to say something he wasn't entirely ready for. What are you doing, Elias? Be honest with me, because I have had enough people be kind to me in ways that cost me later, and I need to know what this is. The directness of it hit him in the sternum. He looked at her for a moment, this woman with mud history on her boots and chalk dust on her sleeve, and a careful, armored quality to her that had probably kept her alive in ways he didn't fully understand yet. He thought about the easy answer, the one that would smooth things over and give her room to keep him at a comfortable distance, and he decided he was done with easy answers. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, he said. I know I think about you more than I think about most things, and I know that when I see you handle yourself, the way you handled Reed, the way you handled Martha, the way you handle those kids, I think you are the most capable and interesting person I've met in a very long time, and I know I'm 27 and you're 41, she said, flat, like she was daring him to finish the sentence wrong. And I don't care about that the way you think I should, he said. I've tried to, for your sake. I can't make myself. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing at the loose shingles on the building next door with a rhythmic complaint that had probably been going on for weeks and that neither of them noticed until just now. Vivian looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. He had the sense that looking away right now would be the worst possible thing, that she needed to see that he meant what he said and wasn't going to soften it or walk it back. That, she said finally, is going to cause a great deal of trouble. Yes, he said. For both of us. Yes. More for me than for you, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just precision. The arithmetic of how these things worked in a town like this. I know, he said. I'm sorry for that. I can't be sorry for the rest. She turned away from him then and looked out the south window at the sky, which had gone the flat gray of coming snow. He watched her back and didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. She had the information now, and she'd do with it what she decided to do with it, and rushing her would be the same as destroying whatever chance he had. Go home, Elias, she said, not unkindly. It's going to snow. He went home. It snowed. 6 inches overnight, the first real snow of the season, and Ridge Hollow woke up the next morning quieter and smaller and sealed off from the rest of the world in the way that only deep snow makes a small town feel, like a jar with the lid screwed on tight. He didn't go into town for 4 days. When he finally did, he had a reason that was entirely legitimate. A split fence post that needed a replacement piece from the hardware store. And he told himself he wasn't going past the schoolhouse, and then went past the schoolhouse. The windows were bright with lamplight against the early dark, and he could hear, faintly, a child's voice reading aloud from inside, and Vivian's voice responding with a correction or encouragement, low and steady. He kept walking. He got his fence post. He was tying it to his saddle when Bobby Whitfield materialized out of the dark beside him with the uncanny ability of 15-year-olds to appear exactly where they aren't expected. She kept a book for you, Bobby said. Elias looked at him. What? Miss Ashcroft, we were packing up stuff that came in the supply order and there was an extra almanac and she set it aside and said, "That's for Mr. Harper." Bobby shrugged with the elaborate unconcern of someone who had noticed something significant and was pretending not to have. Just thought you should know. He rode home with the almanac sitting in his saddlebag like it weighed 10 pounds. It was a farming almanac, the practical kind. Predictions for weather and planting seasons and tables for moon phases and frost dates. There was nothing personal about it. It was the kind of thing a school teacher might set aside for a rancher because it was useful to a rancher and she had an extra one. That was a completely reasonable explanation. He opened it when he got home, and a small folded piece of paper fell out of the middle. He held it under the lamp for a long time before he opened it. When he did, there were 6 words in handwriting that was precise and small and had been clearly produced by someone who had considered each word carefully before writing it. I am not saying no. He sat with that for a long time. He put the paper in his coat pocket. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind moving over his land and thought that 6 words had never done so much work before in his life. He was still thinking about it 4 days later when the trouble with Thomas Reed came to a head. It happened in the open, which was probably not how Thomas intended it. He had come to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon when the last of the children were leaving, and Vivian was standing at the door watching them go, the way she always did, making sure the younger ones were collected by someone responsible. Thomas had waited until the last child was gone, and then said something. Low. Elias wasn't close enough to hear it. And whatever it was had made Vivian's posture change in a way that Elias recognized from the morning on the muddy road. The very still quality that was not acceptance, but was the containment of a strong response. Elias was across the street. He made no move toward them. Thomas put his hand on Vivian's arm. Not hard. Not violently. Just the casual, proprietorial touch of a man who had decided something about a situation that the other person in the situation had not agreed to. The kind of touch that assumes. Vivian looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at Thomas. Then she said something short and precise and removed his hand from her arm herself, with her other hand, and stepped back into the doorway so that there was a threshold between them, and Thomas's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Elias crossed the street. "Evening, Thomas," he said, coming up beside the man in a way that was not confrontational, but was also not coincidental. "Cold coming in." Thomas looked at him. The calculation in his eyes was clear and not particularly disguised. "Harper," he said. "We were having a conversation." "I'm sure you were," Elias said pleasantly. He looked at Vivian. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was not relief. She hadn't needed rescuing, and he knew better than to pretend she had. But it was close to gratitude, or maybe closer to the particular feeling of not being alone in something. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I was wondering if you had a chance to look at that almanac." The corner of her mouth moved. "I did," she said. "Some of the frost predictions seem optimistic for this elevation." "I thought the same thing." Thomas Reed looked between the two of them. His expression did the thing faces do when a man who expected to win realizes he's already lost, and the losing happened somewhere he wasn't watching. He said a clipped good evening and walked away, and his walk had the particular stiffness of someone managing their dignity. Vivian watched him go. Then she looked at Elias. "The frost predictions," she said. "Very natural topic of conversation," he said. She almost laughed. It got about halfway out before she caught it, but he saw it, and she saw him see it, and neither of them said anything about it. "Come in," she said. "I have the rest of that terrible coffee." "I'll take it," he said. He went inside. The schoolroom felt different at night, with the lamps and the dark windows and the small chairs pushed back under their desks. She poured him coffee, and they stood at the teacher's desk and talked about the almanac, about the children, about the way the Johnson homestead 3 miles east had lost most of its hay stores in a fire last week, and the family was going to have a difficult winter. They talked the way people talk when they're not just talking about the things they're talking about, when there's another conversation running underneath that they're both aware of and neither has quite given a name to yet. He left at 8 o'clock. At the door he turned back and she was still standing at her desk and the lamplight was behind her. "The paper in the almanac," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes." "I'm going to remember that you wrote it," he said. "I know," she said. "Go home, Elias." He went home. The cold had moved in fully now, the serious cold that wouldn't leave until March, and the stars over his land were brutal and clear, and the world felt immense in the way it only does in Wyoming in winter, when you are very small and everything around you is very large, and you are somehow still standing. He went inside and fed the stove and sat by the fire and thought about a woman who had driven herself halfway across the country alone and landed in a muddy rut on his road and solved the problem with a piece of rope and sheer determination, and how she had never in her life gotten anything by waiting for someone else to hand it to her, and how maybe that was exactly why no one had ever actually held on. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain and ran across the valley and shook the bare aspens along the creek, and Ridge Hollow closed itself in against the cold, and in a small room above the schoolhouse a lamp burned for a long time before it finally went dark. The lamp above the schoolhouse burned late most nights now, and people noticed. That was the thing about small towns in winter. When the world compressed itself down to a few streets and a handful of buildings huddled against the cold, every light that stayed on past 9 o'clock became a subject of conversation. Vivian didn't know this yet, not fully, but she was learning. December came in without apology. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer at the hardware store hadn't visited in 3 years, and the ranchers who'd been optimistic about their hay stores in October were doing quiet arithmetic in November and coming up with numbers they didn't like. The Johnson family, who'd lost their hay in the fire, were already in trouble. Two other homesteads east of town were not far behind. Elias knew all of this the way ranchers know things, through the network of small observations that accumulates over years of paying attention to land and weather and the way other people's faces look when they're worried. He started quietly moving hay from his own stores before anyone asked him to. Not a grand gesture, just bales showing up on the Johnson property one morning. No note, no witness. And old Carl Johnson standing in his barn doorway, looking at them with the particular expression of a proud man who has been spared the humiliation of having to ask. Vivian heard about this too. Bobby Whitfield, who seemed to function as a one-person intelligence network for things Elias did quietly, mentioned it in passing one afternoon when she was keeping him after school to work through a set of arithmetic problems he'd been avoiding. Mr. Harper brought hay to the Johnsons, Bobby said, pencil moving across his slate without looking up. Carl Johnson didn't even say thank you, from what I heard. Just acted like it appeared on its own. Some men find it hard to receive help, Vivian said. Mr. Harper didn't seem to care either way. Bobby erased something and rewrote it. He's like that. Does stuff and doesn't make a production out of it. Vivian looked at the boy's bent head for a moment. Finish your problems, Bobby. Yes, ma'am. She went back to grading papers. But she sat with what he'd said for the rest of the evening, and when she finally blew out her lamp at nearly 11 o'clock, she lay in the dark of her small room above the classroom and thought about a man who did things without making a production out of it, and how that was either the most genuine quality a person could have or the most patient kind of strategy, and how she still wasn't certain which it was, and how the uncertainty itself was telling her something she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The blizzard came on a Thursday. Nobody predicted how bad it would get. The morning started gray and quiet, the particular quiet that precedes heavy snow, when the air seems to hold its breath. Vivian had her 11 students in their seats by 8 o'clock, and the first flakes started around 9, and by 10 the visibility outside the windows had dropped to almost nothing. She kept teaching. The children were restless, watching the windows with the excited anxiety of young animals sensing weather, but she kept them focused with a firmness that acknowledged their nerves without indulging them. By noon, it was clear that no one was going home on schedule. She sent Bobby Whitfield to the door to look out, and he came back with snow on his shoulders and a face that was trying not to show how serious it was. Can't see the mercantile from here, he said, and that's only 40 feet. The younger children started getting frightened then, the way children do when they can see that the adults around them are working harder than usual to seem calm. Vivian moved through the room with steady, deliberate motions, stoked the stove, handed out the dried apples she kept for emergencies, organized the older children into partners with the younger ones so that everyone had someone next to them. We're going to stay right here, she said, in the voice she used for facts rather than reassurances. This building is solid. The stove has wood. Nobody is going anywhere until someone comes for us. Who's coming? Asked May Carpenter, who was 7 and had been crying quietly for 20 minutes. Someone always comes, Vivian said, and she said it with a certainty she only half felt, because the honest answer was that she didn't know, and the honest answer was not what 7-year-old May Carpenter needed right now. What she didn't know, because she couldn't see it, was that the storm had also caught 4 of her students on the road. The Aldrich children, 3 of them, ages 8, 10, and 13, had been absent from school that morning because their mother was sick and their father had gone to town before the snow started to get medicine, and he'd sent the children after him at 11 o'clock, thinking the weather would hold long enough. He'd been wrong. By the time he reached the edge of town and turned around looking for them, the snow was so thick and so fast that he'd lost all sense of direction in under a minute. His name was Frank Aldrich, and he stumbled into the feed store in a state that Cal Hennessy later described as a man standing at the edge of himself, which was as precise a description as any. Nora Clement's daughter was also on the road. 12 years old, had left early to run an errand at the Aldrich farm, and was caught between both places when the storm locked down. 4 children. Miles of white nothing between them and every adult who wanted to find them. Frank Aldrich got to Elias through Pete Greer of all people, which was its own strange note in the story. Pete Greer, who had been part of the Whisper campaign against Vivian since September, was the one who grabbed Elias by the arm in the street and said, "Harper, Frank Aldrich's kids are out on the East Road." Elias didn't ask questions. He went back to his horse. Three other men tried to stop him before he made it to the edge of town. The first was Cal Hennessy, who said it was suicidal to go out in this and that they should wait for the snow to ease. Elias looked at him and said, "Those are children, Cal," and kept walking. The second was Thomas Reed, who fell into step beside him for half a block and then stopped and said, "You can't see your hand in front of your face out there." And Elias said, "I know this road better than I know my own name," and kept walking. The third was Frank Aldrich himself, who grabbed Elias's coat with both hands and said he was going with him. And Elias looked at the man, pale, hands shaking, not with cold, but with the specific terror of a parent, and said, "Frank, I need you to stay here and be the one who's ready when I bring them back. Can you do that?" Frank Aldrich was not a small man, and he had never in his life needed to be talked down from anything. He stood in the blowing snow, and something moved across his face that was too raw to look at directly, and he let go of Elias's coat. "Bring them back," he said. "I'm going to," Elias said. He had his rope. He had the wool blankets he kept strapped to his saddle for overnight work in winter. He had a lantern that the wind was going to fight him for, and he had 17 years of knowing every dip and rise and fence post on the East Road by feel, if not by sight. He also had the knowledge, clear and cold as the air itself, that if he went the wrong direction even once in this visibility, he might not find his way back either. He went anyway. Back in the schoolhouse, Vivian had moved the children away from the windows and gathered them around the stove, the small ones in front and the bigger ones behind, and she was doing something that none of the children had expected, which was telling them a story. Not a lesson. A story, the kind she'd read as a girl, and her voice was even and steady, and the story gave them something to put their minds on. That wasn't the howling outside the walls, and one by one the crying stopped, though May Carpenter kept her hand in Vivian's for a long time. Bobby Whitfield was at the door. He'd appointed himself to that post without being asked, opening it every few minutes to look out and then closing it against the cold. Vivian let him. He needed to feel useful, and 15-year-old boys with something to do are better than 15-year-old boys with nothing to do. At the third check, he didn't close the door right away. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. She looked up. "Something's moving out there." She set May Carpenter's hand gently in the hand of the girl next to her and stood up and crossed to the door. The cold hit her face like a flat palm. She looked out into the white and couldn't see anything for a moment, and then she did. A shape, dark, moving in a way that was too deliberate for random wind coming from the east. Then another shape, smaller. Then three smaller shapes, huddled together, moving. She didn't wait. She grabbed her coat from the peg by the door and stepped outside, and the wind took her breath immediately. She pushed into it and moved toward the shapes, and the largest one resolved itself into Elias Harper, snowblind and walking by feel, with a child tucked under each arm and a third gripping the back of his coat, and behind them, barely visible, a fourth figure, Nora Clement's daughter, moving on her own but staying close. "I've got them," Elias said, and his voice was wrong. Not hurt, but exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "I see that," Vivian said, and she moved to the 12-year-old girl and put her arm around her and turned them all toward the light in the schoolhouse window. She had never been so grateful for a bad lamp. Getting all four children inside and thawed out took the better part of an hour. The Aldrich children were cold but whole, the youngest one crying from relief more than anything else. Nora Clement's daughter had ice on her eyelashes and couldn't stop shaking for 20 minutes, but she was all right. Vivian moved through the room with efficient calm, checking each child's fingers and ears for the dead white color of frostbite, wrapping them in the blankets Elias had brought, getting hot water on the stove. Elias sat on the floor with his back against the wall and watched her work. He was in the kind of tired that doesn't let you pretend to be anything other than what you are. His coat was frozen solid along the shoulders, and his face had the tight, wind-scoured look of a man who has been outside in serious cold for too long. He didn't say anything. He watched Vivian move through the room and check each child and speak to them in the calm, factual voice that made them believe they were fine. And he thought that he had seen people panic in bad situations, and he had seen people freeze, and he had seen people perform bravery for an audience, and none of those things were what she was doing. She was simply the most useful person in the room, without drama, without needing anyone to notice. At some point, she crouched down beside him with a tin cup of water. "You should drink this," she said. "I know." He took it. His hands were stiff and he managed it clumsily, and she waited without comment while he got his grip right. "All four," she said. "All four," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone processing something that is larger than the situation immediately in front of them. "You went out in that alone," she said. "I know the road." "That's not the same as it being sane." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Something moved in her face. She looked away from him at the children arranged around the stove, and he could see her jaw work slightly, the way people's jaws work when they are keeping something in. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she'd said it that first day on the muddy road. Measured, precise, meaning more than the word itself. "They're your kids," he said, more or less. She looked at him again, startled, and then something in her expression opened in a way he hadn't seen before. Just for a second. Then she stood up and went back to work. By 3 o'clock, the storm had eased enough that people could move through town, and Frank Aldrich came through that schoolhouse door and crossed the room in 5 steps, and gathered all 3 of his children against him with the complete disregard for dignity that only a parent who nearly lost something can access. Nobody in the room said anything. Bobby Whitfield looked at the ceiling. Even the youngest Aldrich child, who was 8 and had been trying very hard to seem brave, broke down completely and just cried into her father's shoulder. Nora Clement came for her daughter 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway and looked at Vivian and couldn't find a sentence long enough for what she was feeling, so she settled for grabbing Vivian's hand with both of hers and holding it. "You kept them calm," Nora said. "They kept each other calm," Vivian said. "I just gave them something to listen to." "Don't do that," Nora said firmly. "Don't shrink it." Vivian blinked. It was a small thing, but Elias, watching from across the room, saw it. The slight surprise of a woman who was not accustomed to being told to stop making herself smaller. The parents began to disperse back into the post-storm wreckage of the afternoon, collecting children and accounting for property and doing the 100 small tasks that follow severe weather. The schoolroom emptied gradually until it was just Vivian and Elias and Bobby Whitfield, who was sweeping the floor with great thoroughness for a boy who had never shown particular enthusiasm for tidiness. "Bobby," Vivian said. "Almost done," he said. "Go home. Your mother is going to be out of her mind." He put the broom against the wall. At the door he stopped and turned back and looked at Elias with an expression that was somewhere between 15 years old and 35. "Good job," he said simply, and went out. The door closed and the room was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the storm was still moving, but the worst of it had passed, and the air had that clean, emptied quality that follows hard weather. Elias pushed himself up off the floor. His body protested this, and he let it, moving slowly, not pretending. Vivian watched him without comment. "I should get back," he said. "Your face is still half frozen," she said. "It'll thaw on the ride." "Elias." She said his name the way people say names when they want to stop movement, and he stopped. She crossed to the small cupboard beside her desk and came back with a cloth that she had run under the warm water, and she held it out to him. He took it and held it against the side of his face that had taken the worst of the wind, and the warmth was extraordinary, the specific relief of something cold returning to itself, and he must have made some involuntary sound because her expression shifted slightly. "Sit down for 5 minutes," she said. "You're not going to get anywhere faster by falling off your horse." He sat back down, this time in a chair like a person, rather than on the floor, like a man who has given up. And she sat across from him at her desk, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they have just come through something together. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask?" "The Kansas situation. The husband." He watched her face. "Did he hurt you?" A pause. "Not the way you mean. Not physically." She looked at her hands on the desk. "He just systematically removed everything that was mine. My opinions, my standing in the community, my income, eventually, because he controlled the school board. When I left, I had a wagon, 2 mules, about $40, and a set of teaching certificates he couldn't take because they were in my name." She looked up. "So no, not physically, but there's more than one way to break a person's ability to trust anything." "I know," he said. "Do you?" He thought about it honestly. Not the same way you do, but I know what it is to have people decide what you are before you've had a chance to show them. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her making the connection. The age gap, the town's reaction, the way people had been looking at him since September with the particular pity people reserve for someone they believe is making an obvious mistake. It's different for you, she said. You live here. You have land. You have history in this place. For me, she gestured at the room around her, the schoolhouse, the rented room above, all of it. This is everything I have. If this town turns on me, I don't have somewhere else to go back to. I know that, he said, and I'm not asking you to risk it. Then what are you asking? He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the cloth still in his hands. I'm asking you to tell me when I'm being useful and when I'm in your way. I'm asking you to let me be, he paused, choosing, a person in your life without it having to be a declaration or a scandal. I'm asking you to take it slow enough that you can trust the ground you're standing on. She looked at him for a long time. That's a very careful thing to ask. I'm a careful person. No, she said, with something very close to sharpness. You just walked alone into a blizzard. He opened his mouth and closed it again. That's not careful, she said. That's brave, which is different. Brave people can also be reckless. I've known reckless men who called themselves brave. All right, he said, then I'm asking you to trust that the reckless thing I just did was for those kids, not to impress you. Even though... He stopped. Even though what? Even though I was thinking about you the whole way out there. He said it without embellishment. Not like it wasn't a romantic thought. It was more like, I kept thinking, Vivian is keeping those children calm right now, which means I have to bring them back, because she's promised them someone's coming. The room was very quiet again. Vivian looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that the simple acknowledgement of the weight is almost too much to take in. Someone always comes, she said softly. What? That's what I told May Carpenter when she asked who was coming. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't certain it was true when I said it, but it was. Yes. A pause. It was. The stove ticked. Wind moved past the windows. Somewhere outside, Ridge Hollow was putting itself back together after the storm, people shoveling paths and checking on neighbors and doing the unglamorous work of survival that made frontier life what it was. It was Thomas Reed who ruined it. He came through the schoolhouse door without knocking, which was not a thing people generally did, and he came in with the specific energy of a man who has been waiting all day for a moment to clarify something and has finally gotten it. He took in the scene, Vivian at her desk, Elias in the chair across from her, close, the particular quiet of the room, and his face did the calculation rapidly and came out on the side of conclusions. So this is where you've been, he said, to Vivian, not to Elias. I've been in my classroom, Vivian said. Her voice had flattened immediately, the careful even tone that she used when she was managing something. People have been looking for you. There's a lot needs doing after a storm like that, and the town could use... She's been here since this morning, Elias said, with 11 children, through the whole storm. Thomas ignored him, which was itself a statement. Vivian. He used her name with the ownership of someone who has decided it belongs to him. This isn't, people are going to talk. People have been talking since September, she said. This is different. His voice dropped, went harder. You know what this looks like. I know what it looks like to you, she said. I'm not responsible for your interpretation. You're responsible for your reputation in this town, and right now, Thomas. Her voice came out quiet and absolute, the voice she used in class when she needed everything to stop. I owe you nothing regarding how I choose to spend my time or who I choose to spend it with. I have been civil to you. I have been honest with you. I would appreciate it if you would extend me the same courtesy and leave my classroom. Thomas's jaw went tight. He looked at Elias with an expression that had anger in it, but mostly had the wounded pride of a man who has been displaced by something he doesn't understand. You're making a mistake, he said, to Vivian, about Elias. The way men talk about things that are not objects as though they are. That is entirely possible, Vivian said, but it's mine to make. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he left. The door didn't slam. He had enough control for that. but it closed with a conclusiveness that said everything a slam would have. Vivian sat very still for a moment after he was gone. Elias didn't say anything. He'd learned over these weeks that she needed space after confrontations to come back to herself, that she didn't want to be immediately asked if she was all right because she found the question slightly insulting, and that the best thing he could do was simply be present without requiring her to manage him. After a minute, she said, "He's going to say things." "Yes. Worse than Martha Greer." "Probably." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I wasn't lying to him. I don't know if I'm making a mistake." "You weren't making any kind of decision just now," Elias said. "You were sitting in your classroom after a very long day." "That's not how he'll tell it." "No." He stood up slowly, still stiff. "Vivian, whatever he says, whatever comes from this, it doesn't change what you did today, or what those kids needed, or what the Aldrich family is going to feel about you for the rest of their lives." He picked up his hat. "Your value in this community isn't something Thomas Reed gets to determine." She looked up at him. "You sound very certain of that." "I am certain of it." "Most people here would disagree with you." "Then I'll disagree with most people here." He put his hat on. "I've been doing it my whole life. It's not as hard as it sounds once you decide what actually matters." He crossed to the door. At the threshold he stopped, not turning around. "Vivian." "Yes." "Whatever you decide, about any of it." He paused. "I'll still be on the road." He went out into the cold in the aftermath of the storm, and the door settled closed behind him, and he walked to where his horse had weathered the blizzard in the lean-to behind the schoolhouse, and stood for a moment with his forehead against the horse's neck, just breathing, feeling the warmth of the animal, and the solid fact of still being upright after a day that could have gone very differently. Above him, the lamp in the schoolroom window stayed on. He rode home in the dark. The snow lay thick and unmarked across the valley, and his horse moved through it steadily, knowing the way. And the sky had cleared after the storm to the violent clarity that only comes after violence, and every star was absolutely sharp. He thought about Vivian's face when she'd said, "That's what I told May Carpenter." He thought about the Aldrich children in their father's arms. He thought about Thomas Reed's expression, and knew that wasn't the last of that, not even close. The town was going to make them both pay for today. It would find a way because towns always found a way, because they were built out of people who could not tolerate things they hadn't approved. And what had happened today in that schoolhouse, the particular ordinary intimacy of two people sitting together after something hard, the way she'd given him the cloth and told him to sit, the way he'd said, "I was thinking about you the whole way out there." All of it was the kind of thing that fed the particular hunger Ridge Hollow had developed for this story. He knew all of this. He rode through it, and he didn't turn back. He'd told her he'd be on the road. He meant it. The horse crested the long hill above the ranch, and he could see his own lamplight below, the small warm square of it in the dark. And he thought that whatever came next was going to require both of them to be braver than they had any right to expect of themselves. And that the woman he'd left sitting in that schoolhouse was, for all her careful distances and her measured words and her 40 cents and her 6-word notes tucked into almanacs, probably the bravest person he had ever met. The storm had passed. What came after the storm was going to be worse, and neither of them was going to run from it. Thomas Reed was efficient in his damage. That was the word for it, efficient. He didn't rage or accuse openly, because he was too smart for that, and Ridge Hollow was too small for obvious lies to survive very long unchallenged. Instead, he did what people with social standing do when they want to dismantle someone else's. He asked questions. Concerned questions, the kind wrapped in the language of worry. Did you hear about those children being kept in the schoolhouse alone with the two of them? Doesn't it seem like the rescue could have waited for safer conditions? I'm not saying anything. I'm just wondering if the school board has given proper thought to who they've hired. The school board was 3 men. Pete Greer was one of them. By the following Monday, Vivian received a letter. She read it at her desk before the children arrived, and Elias, who came by that morning with no particular errand, but with the awareness that Monday was going to carry the weight of the week before it, found her standing with the letter in her hand and a very specific stillness to her that he had learned to recognize as the posture she held when she was deciding how angry to allow herself to be. "Sit down," she said without looking up. He sat. She handed him the letter. He read it. It was formal, measured, written in the careful language of men who want to do something unkind and would prefer to do it without fingerprints. The school board of Ridge Hollow wished to express its ongoing commitment to the moral standing of the community and its educational institutions. It wished to remind Miss Ashcroft of the terms of her position, which required her to maintain conduct befitting her role as an example to the children of the valley. It wished to note that certain recent observations had given rise to questions among community members. It wished to schedule a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss these matters in full. It did not name Elias. It didn't have to. He put the letter back on the desk. Pete Greer wrote this, he said. Thomas Reed wrote this, she said. Pete Greer signed it. He looked at her. She was still standing, her arms crossed, her jaw in that tight line that meant the anger was being managed rather than felt. What do you want to do? He said. I want to do several things that would confirm every concern they have about my character, she said flatly. Then she exhaled through her nose and set the letter face down on the desk. I'm going to go to the meeting. I'm going to answer their questions. And I'm going to be so composed and so reasonable that there is nothing in anything I say or do that they can use against me. That's a very controlled response. I'm a very controlled person. I know. He paused. Vivian, I can come to the meeting. No. Immediate. Certain. It might help to have, it would make everything worse and you know it. She looked at him directly. My ability to manage this depends entirely on it being about my professional conduct and nothing else. If you're in that room, it becomes about us, and right now there isn't an us in any form that a school board can examine, so I would like to keep it that way. She picked up a piece of chalk. I have 11 children arriving in 20 minutes. He stood up. He wanted to say something useful and couldn't find it, which was its own frustration. He picked up his hat. Whatever they say in that meeting, he said, it doesn't change anything on my end. She was already writing on the board, but she paused for half a beat. I know, she said, and went back to writing. He left. He went home and fed his animals and fixed 3 things on the fence line that didn't urgently need fixing and came back inside and sat at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold in front of him, thinking about the particular helplessness of watching someone face something alone because your presence would make it worse. The meeting was Wednesday evening. He didn't go anywhere near the town hall. He found out what happened from Nora Clement, who found out from her husband, who had been at the hardware store next door to the town hall and had heard raised voices at one point through the shared wall. What Nora conveyed was this, that Vivian had walked in and answered every question with a directness that apparently left Pete Greer visibly uncomfortable, that when asked about the propriety of her conduct during the storm, she had described in methodical detail the actions she had taken to keep 11 children safe for 6 hours without heat loss or injury, and had asked which specific action the board found inappropriate. That when Thomas Reed, who had attended as a concerned community member rather than a board member, suggested that her relationship with Elias Harper represented a conflict with her role as a moral example, she had looked at him for a long moment and then asked whether the board had a written policy regarding the personal associations of its teachers, and when they admitted they did not, she had said that she considered the matter closed until such a policy existed. She had walked out with her job intact. Elias heard all of this and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Monday morning. Then Nora said one more thing. She also told them, Nora said, with the careful tone of someone delivering news they're not sure how to classify, that if the board wished to discuss her professional conduct further, she would welcome the opportunity, but that she would also be writing to the county education office to understand their policies on board overreach, and she wanted them to be aware of that before they scheduled any additional meetings. Elias stared at her. She said that, he said, word for word, according to my husband, who has very good hearing. Nora's expression was somewhere between impressed and entertained. Thomas Reed left before the meeting officially ended. He rode home that evening thinking that he had severely underestimated the width of Vivian Ashcroft's spine, which was saying something because he'd had a high opinion of it to begin with. He also knew it wasn't over. Thomas Reed was not a man who absorbed a public setback quietly, and Pete Greer was still on the school board, and the winter still had 2 months left in it, and 2 months in Ridge Hollow with a grudge working against you was a very long time. What he didn't anticipate was that the change would come not from the opposition, but from the people who had been watching from the middle ground, the families who hadn't firmly landed on either side, who had children in Vivian's classroom and debts of neighborly goodwill and the practical frontier awareness that in a hard winter, You needed the people around you more than you needed to be right about them. It started with the Aldrich family. Frank Aldrich was not a demonstrative man. He was not a man who attended social gatherings, or made speeches, or placed himself in situations that required expressing his feelings in public. He was a rancher with rough hands and a square face, and the efficient emotional vocabulary of someone who had learned that feelings were most useful when converted directly into action. So when he showed up at the school board's next public meeting, a routine monthly affair that usually drew 6 people counting the board members themselves, and sat down in the front row and looked at Pete Greer without saying a word, it was notable. He'd brought Carl Johnson with him. Carl Johnson, who still hadn't said thank you to Elias for the hay, which was his way, but who sat in that meeting hall with the same square stillness as Frank Aldrich. 4 other ranch families came in behind them. Pete Greer looked at his board members. His board members looked at the room. The meeting was technically about road maintenance funding. Nobody spoke about Vivian Ashcroft directly, but Frank Aldrich raised his hand when the board asked if there were community concerns and said, in the deliberate way of a man who has chosen each word in advance, that he wanted to go on record as saying the Ridge Hollow. School had not had a teacher of this quality in his 10 years in the valley, and that he considered the school's current operation to be one of the community's strongest assets, and that he would be paying close attention to any decisions that affected it. He sat back down. Carl Johnson said, "Same," which was the longest public statement he'd made in 3 years. Pete Greer said he was glad the school was serving the community well. Thomas Reed, who had come to the meeting for his own reasons, said nothing. He left early, and people noticed that too. Elias wasn't at the meeting. He heard about it the next morning from Bobby Whitfield, who had heard about it from his mother, who had been there. Bobby delivered the information with the contained satisfaction of a 15-year-old who has seen something go right. Mr. Aldrich said strongest asset, Bobby reported. My mom said Thomas Reed looked like he bit something sour. Your mother shouldn't be teaching you to enjoy other people's discomfort, Elias said. No, sir, Bobby said, with an expression that suggested he would continue to enjoy it regardless. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a sudden reversal. It was more like the way ice thaws. Not all at once, not dramatically, but by slow degrees, a softening at the edges, a change in quality rather than a single visible event. People who had been coldly polite to Vivian in the mercantile became neutrally polite. People who had been neutral began to actually speak to her. Nora Clement started stopping by the school on Tuesday afternoons to help with the younger children's reading, not as a formal arrangement, but just because she had the time and her own children were older, and she liked how the classroom felt. Martha Greer remained the holdout. She was polite to Vivian with a precision that was its own kind of hostility, the complete correctness of a woman who had decided to be impeccable where previously she had been cruel, which was its own way of communicating that the opinion hadn't changed, only the expression of it. Vivian understood this and made no effort to change it. She was not in the business of pursuing people who did not want to be pursued, which was a decision that had saved her significant energy over the years. January ended. February came in harder and colder and stripped the last of the romanticism from the winter, leaving only the bare functional business of staying alive and warm and getting through until March. 3 ranch families were struggling, the Hennessy homestead worst among them. Cal had hurt his back in December and hadn't been able to work properly since, and without his labor the place was slipping. Elias organized 3 men to go out twice a week and cover what Cal couldn't do. He did it through the feed store, practically, framing it as neighbor work rather than charity, which was the only language most frontier men could receive help in without it costing them something. Vivian found out about this the same way she found out about most things Elias did, sideways through a third party, after the fact. He's been doing that since January, Nora told her, sitting at the back of the classroom on a Tuesday afternoon while the children read silently. Organized it like a work schedule, Monday and Thursday, 2 men each time. He put himself on both days. Vivian kept her eyes on the children. Why hasn't Cal said anything about it in town? Because Cal is Cal, Nora said. He'll never say it directly, but he told my husband that Harper was the best neighbor he'd had in 20 years. She paused. Which, coming from Cal, is basically a monument. Vivian looked out the window at the February sky, which was the dull gray of old pewter. She had been thinking over the past weeks, with more frequency and less internal argument than before. The opposition had not broken her, and it had not broken Elias, and she was aware that this was significant. Not because she had needed to test him, exactly, but because the world has a way of testing people for you if you wait long enough, and the results of the test mattered. She had watched him stay steady through 2 months of sideways looks and whispered commentary and social inconvenience. She had watched him do it without complaining to her about it, without making her responsible for managing his discomfort, without once suggesting that the situation was costing him something she ought to feel guilty for. She had watched him organize hay deliveries and fence repairs, and backbreaking Thursday labor for a man who hadn't even thanked him, and she understood that she was looking at the consistent character of a person rather than the performed virtue of someone trying to be seen in a particular light. She was not in love with him yet, or she was not ready to call it that yet, which was not the same thing, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. But she also knew that when she was in her small room above the classroom and the wind was doing its worst and the building shook slightly on its foundations, the thought that steadied her was not abstract. It had a specific shape. It had work boots and a voice that said, "I'll still be on the road," and meant it. It was the last Thursday in February when Elias came to the school for the first time with nothing to fix. He knocked, which he always did, and she said, "Come in," and he came in with his hat in his hands and no tools and no lumber and no evident errand, and he stood in the middle of the classroom and said, "I'd like to take you somewhere, if you're willing." She put down her pen. "Where?" "There's a place on my land, east section, where the creek comes around a bend. It's nothing in summer, but in February the ice does something. I can't explain it, you'd have to see it. It's maybe an hour's ride." He paused. "It's a Saturday thing, if you don't have other plans." She looked at him for a moment. He stood there with his hat turning slowly in his hands, not pretending to be unaware that this was a different kind of asking than anything before it. "That's a very specific invitation," she said. "It's a very specific thing," he said. She said yes. Saturday came with a sky that was still cold but had a different quality to it. Thinner, somehow, as if winter was starting to remember that it wasn't permanent. She rode her own horse, which she had been slowly learning to manage with the same methodical determination she brought to everything, and he rode beside her without crowding her, and they talked, on the hour-long ride, in a way they had never quite talked before. Not about the town or the children or the school board or the weather in its functional sense, but about things further back. She told him about Ohio, about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself, and who had treated her mind as something worth developing at a time when many men in his position treated daughters as something to be prettily arranged for marriage. About the particular loneliness of being the kind of woman who was good at things that other people didn't think women were supposed to be good at, and how that loneliness compounds over decades until it starts to feel like your natural state. He told her about his father, who had died when Elias was 19, and left him the ranch and no instruction manual, and the first 3 years of running it alone, making expensive mistakes with the animals and the land, and then slowly getting better through the simple, unromantic mechanism of failing and adjusting and trying again. About the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who assumed that because you were young and male and had land, you must have everything roughly sorted, and how nobody thought to ask the 20-year-old running a ranch alone if he was all right. "Were you?" she asked. "Not particularly," he said. "Got better at pretending." "That's the wrong skill to develop," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "What's the right one?" She thought about it seriously, which was how she considered most things. "Getting better at knowing who's worth being honest with," she said, "and being honest with them." He looked at her sideways. "How's that working for you?" The corner of her mouth moved. "I'm still gathering data." They reached the creek bend, and she understood immediately what he meant about not being able to explain it. The ice had formed in sheets along the curve of the water where the current slowed, and where the sun hit it in the late morning light. It did something prismatic, throwing color in all directions. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing you'd put in a painting, but subtly, the way things in nature are beautiful when they're not trying to be. When they're just doing what they do and you happen to be there to see it. She sat on her horse and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He let her look. "This is yours," she said finally. Not a question. "This piece of land is mine, yes. You come here." "When I need to think clearly," he said. "The cold helps. And I don't know, it's honest." The ice doesn't do that for anybody. It just does it. She turned and looked at him then, and something in her expression had shifted. Not dramatically, not a sudden unlocking, but a quality of openness that was different from anything before. As if the defenses were still there but had stepped back a few feet, just enough to let him see the person behind them. "Elias," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without trying to fix it. All right? I am probably not going to be easy," she said, "even if I decide whatever I decide. I have years of habits that are not good for being close to another person. I pull away when I should stay. I push back when I should let things go. I decide I know what someone's going to do before they do it, and then I'm wrong and I can't always apologize for that quickly. I go quiet for days and it has nothing to do with the person I'm with. It's just how I manage, and I know it's not easy to be on the other side of." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you this so that later you can't say you weren't warned." "I'm not going to say that later," he said. "I know what I'm coming toward. I'm not 22 years old, and I don't think people are who I want them to be instead of who they are." He paused. "You're difficult and independent, and you have 12 years of damage from a man who should have been better to you, and you are the most interesting person I know, and I am—" He stopped. "I'm in this, Vivian. Whatever shape it takes. I'm in it." She looked at the ice for another moment. Then she looked at him. "I'm not going to say something romantic back to you right now," she said. "I know. I'm going to say that I don't not want this." She said it carefully, precisely, like a woman who has been lied to enough times that she trusts the truth best when it comes in small, exact pieces. "And that is more than I have said to another person in a very long time." He nodded. He didn't press. He didn't translate it into something larger than she'd offered. They rode back to town in the late afternoon, and the light was already going, and the cold was settling back in, and they talked about Cal Hennessy's back and whether the creek would clear by April, and at the edge of town she slowed her horse, and he slowed his. "Same time next Saturday?" he said. She looked at him. Something in her face that was close to warmth, close to what in another woman, at another time, might have been the beginning of a smile that had nowhere particular to hide. "Yes," she said, and rode toward the schoolhouse. What happened next came not from Thomas Reed, who had grown quieter since the school board meeting, nor from Martha Greer, who had retreated into impeccable politeness. It came from a letter addressed to the Ridge Hollow School Board, postmarked from a town in Kansas. Pete Greer received it on a Monday. By Wednesday, it had passed through 4 sets of hands, and Vivian didn't know about it because the people holding it had not yet decided what to do with it. Elias found out on Thursday from Carl Johnson, of all people, who apparently felt that the Hay had incurred an obligation he was finally ready to discharge. Carl came to the ranch in the morning, stood at the fence line with his hat in his hands, a gesture that on Carl Johnson was the equivalent of another man getting on his knees, and said in his economical way that there was a letter going around that had come from a Kansas school board and that it said some things about Vivian Ashcroft's time there and that Pete Greer was planning to bring it to the next board meeting. "What does it say?" Elias said. "Says she was dismissed for insubordination, says she created division in the community, says the board wouldn't recommend her for another position." Carl looked at the fence post. "Says her character was questionable." The cold in Elias's chest was not the weather. "Who wrote it?" he said. Carl met his eyes. "Man named Gerald Ashcroft, former husband." Elias stood very still for a moment. The wind moved across the field and the aspens along the creek shook their bare branches. "When's the board meeting?" he said. "Next Monday." He thanked Carl. Carl went home. Elias went inside and sat down and thought for a long time about what Vivian had told him, about Kansas, about the husband who had dismantled her life systematically and professionally before she could cross the county line. He thought about a man who, nearly 2 years later and 1,000 miles away, was still reaching across that distance to close doors in front of her. He thought about Vivian not knowing yet. He went to her that afternoon. She opened the schoolhouse door and saw his face and said immediately, "What happened?" He told her. He told her all of it, plainly, without softening the edges, because he understood by now that she needed the truth at full strength, and that giving it to her at a dilution was its own kind of disrespect. She stood with her arms crossed and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds, which was a long 30 seconds to stand in. "Gerald," she said. "Yes." "He's had that letter ready," she said. Not a question. He's been waiting until it would do the most damage. She wasn't surprised. That was the worst part. The complete absence of surprise on her face, which meant she had always known this was a possibility, had been waiting for it somewhere in the back of her accounting. There's a board meeting Monday, Elias said. I'll go. I'll go with you. Elias, not to speak for you, he said, not to fix it, to sit in the room. He held her gaze. You faced the last one alone. This one's different. This one is a man from your past using a position he no longer has to try to end your future. That's different, and I'm not going to be 20 feet away waiting. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it. The calculation of what his presence would cost her. The opposing calculation of what facing Gerald's shadow alone would cost her. The complicated arithmetic of allowing herself to be accompanied. You sit in the back, she said finally. Wherever you want me. You don't speak unless I ask you to. Agreed. And if I tell you to leave, I'll leave, he said, without argument. She uncrossed her arms. It was a small thing, but he'd learned to read her small things. All right, she said. He went home. He sat on his porch in the cold and looked at the valley that was still gray with winter and felt the specific anger of a person who is watching someone be hurt by something they can't fully stop, only stand beside. Gerald Ashcroft was in Kansas, and there was nothing Elias could put his hands on, which was its own frustration. But Monday was coming, and whatever Gerald's letter said, whatever Pete Greer planned to do with it, Vivian was going to walk into that room and answer it with the same composed, exact, devastating clarity she brought to everything. And this time, she wasn't going to be the only person in her corner. He looked at the aspens along the creek, bare and dark against the last light. The ice on the creek would start to go in another 6 weeks, maybe 7. The water would move again. The valley would turn green. He had made it through harder winters than this. So had she. The difference was that this one, they were going to make it through together, and that was not a small difference. That was, in fact, everything. Monday came the way hard days always come. Ordinary on the outside, with the same cold air and the same gray sky and the same sounds of a small town going about its business. So that if you didn't know what was happening inside the town hall at 7 o'clock that evening, you would have had no idea anything was different at all. Vivian spent the day teaching. That was the thing that struck Elias when he came by at noon to check on her. She was simply teaching. Long division with the older students, letter sounds with the younger ones, Bobby Whitfield working through a reading passage at the back of the room with the focused scowl of a boy who has decided that being good at something is worth the effort of being seen trying. The classroom was warm and loud in the specific productive way of a room where work is actually happening, and Vivian moved through it without any visible sign that in 7 hours she was going to have to sit in front of 3 men and answer for a letter written by someone who had spent 4 years trying to remove her ability to answer for herself. She noticed Elias at the door and came over, keeping her voice low. You don't need to stand there looking worried, she said. You're upsetting the children. I'm not worried, he said. You have a worried face. That's just my face. Something moved in her expression, that almost smile that lived at the very edge of her mouth. Go do something useful, she said. Come back at 6:30. He went and did something useful, which was to ride out to Frank Aldrich's place and tell him about the board meeting. He told Carl Johnson, too, and Nora Clement's husband, and the Whitfield family, Bobby's father, who had come around on Vivian in November and hadn't looked back. He didn't ask any of them to come. He just told them plainly what the meeting was about and what the letter said and who had written it. Frank Aldrich said, 6:30, you said? 7, technically, Elias said. 6:30, Frank said again, as if confirming something for himself, and went back inside. Elias rode back to town. At 6:15, the town hall had 4 people in it, Pete Greer and his 2 board members setting up at the front table, and Thomas Reed sitting in the 3rd row with his arms folded, the posture of a man who has been waiting for a vindication that is finally arriving. Pete Greer had Gerald Ashcroft's letter in a folder in front of him, and he kept touching the folder the way people touch things they feel entitled to, with the casual assurance of someone who has already decided how the evening is going to go. At 6:25, Frank Aldrich came in with his wife. Carl Johnson came in behind them. Then Nora Clement and her husband. Then the Whitfields. Then 3 other ranch families who Elias had not spoken to and could not account for, which meant word had traveled through its own channels. By 6:45, the town hall had more people in it than it had seen at any meeting since the water rights dispute of 3 years prior, and Pete Greer was looking at the room with an expression that had shifted considerably from where it had started. Vivian came in at 6:55. Elias was already there, in the back row, left side. She saw him when she came through the door, and there was a fraction of a second where something in her face registered the room. The number of people, the families arranged in the seats, what that meant. And then she composed herself and walked to the front and sat in the chair that had been placed facing the board table. And she sat in it the way she sat in everything, with her back straight and her hands folded and her gray eyes level. She did not look at Thomas Reed. Pete Greer opened the meeting. He was formal about it, which was his armor. Procedural language had always been his way of making uncomfortable things sound institutional rather than personal. I explained that the board had received correspondence pertaining to Miss Ashcroft's previous employment, and that in the interests of transparency and community standards, the board felt it appropriate to discuss the contents of that correspondence with Miss Ashcroft directly. He read the letter. It was worse than what Carl had described to Elias. Gerald Ashcroft had been thorough. The letter described Vivian as insubordinate, as a disruptive influence, as a woman who inserted her personal opinions into matters of community governance, as someone whose conduct had caused irreparable division in their town. It said that the Kansas School Board had voted unanimously to terminate her contract. It said that in good conscience, the writer could not allow another community's children to be placed in the care of someone of such questionable character, and that he felt it his civic duty to make this information available. He had signed it as a concerned former educator. He had not mentioned that he was her ex-husband. He had not mentioned why she had left. The room was very quiet when Pete Greer finished reading. Vivian sat with her hands still folded and her face showing nothing that she hadn't decided to show. "Miss Ashcroft," Pete Greer said, "would you like to respond?" "Yes," she said. "I would." She stood up. She did not have notes. "The letter you just read was written by Gerald Ashcroft," she said. "Gerald Ashcroft is my former husband. We were married for 4 years and divorced 18 months ago. He was a member of the school board in the Kansas town where I taught. When I ended our marriage, he used his position on that board to have my contract terminated and then provided a written account of my tenure to any institution I subsequently applied to, which is why it took me 8 months to find another position and why I arrived in Ridge Hollow in late September rather than August." The room had the quality of air before a storm, so very still, charged. "He describes me as insubordinate," she continued. "The specific insubordination was that I objected, in a board meeting, to a proposal that would have reduced the school week to 3 days in order to free children for agricultural labor during harvest. I was the only person in that room who objected. The proposal passed anyway. I continued to object. He found that difficult to manage." She paused. "Not for effect. It wasn't performed. It was simply the pause of a person making sure they are saying exactly what they mean." He describes a unanimous board vote. The vote was 4-1. I was not on the board. The one dissenting vote was cast by a man named Harold Breen, who has since written to the county education office on my behalf if the board wishes to contact him. She reached into the small bag she carried and placed a folded letter on the table in front of Pete Greer. "That is Mr. Breen's letter. He is the only member of that board who voted his conscience, and his account of my time there is rather different from my former husband's." Pete Greer looked at the letter on the table. Thomas Reed, in the third row, had gone very still. "I understand that this board has an obligation to the community," Vivian said. "I take that obligation seriously myself, which is why I'm telling you this directly rather than asking you to simply take my word against a written document. I have also prepared a summary of my students' academic progress over the past 4 months. If the board would like to evaluate my professional conduct on the basis of my professional work, rather than on the basis of a letter from a man with a personal grievance." She placed a second document on the table. "Bobby Whitfield read at a first-grade level in September. He reads at a fifth-grade level now. May Carpenter, who is 7, can add and subtract 2-digit numbers in her head. Henry Aldrich, who is 13, wrote a 2-page essay last week about water systems that his father said was better than anything he himself could produce." Frank Aldrich, in the 5th row, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close to one. "I am not a perfect teacher," Vivian said. "I am demanding and I have high expectations, and some children find that difficult at first. but I have not once, in any school I have taught at, failed a child who was willing to work. That is my record. And I would ask this board to weigh it against the record of a man who is still, 18 months after our divorce, finding ways to follow me across state lines. She sat back down. The room was quiet for 5 full seconds, which is a very long time in a quiet room. Then Frank Aldrich said from the fifth row, "I have a question for the board." Pete Greer looked at him. "Do you have any complaint," Frank said, "from anyone in this valley about the quality of the teaching in that school? Not about who's fixing roofs or who's talking to who, about the teaching." Pete Greer looked at his board members. His board members looked at the table. "No," Pete Greer said. "Do you have any complaint from any parent in this valley about the safety or welfare of their children in that school?" A pause. "No." "Do any of your children attend that school?" A longer pause. Pete Greer had a 9-year-old daughter who had come home 2 months ago and read him a poem she'd written in class, which was the first poem she'd ever written, and he had put it on the wall next to the fireplace without thinking about it, and it was still there. His jaw worked slightly. "Yes," he said. Frank Aldrich nodded once, the nod of a man who has asked all the questions he needed to ask, and sat back. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Carl Johnson said, from the fourth row, in his minimal way, "The letters from her ex-husband. That's what I heard. That true?" "It appears so," Pete Greer said. Carl Johnson looked at the table where the letter sat, and then looked at Pete Greer with an expression that communicated, without any words at all, what Carl thought of a school board that had nearly acted on a vindictive ex-husband's correspondence, and then he looked back at the front of the room. Thomas Reed stood up. Every head in the room turned toward him. He stood there for a moment, and Elias, watching from the back, could see the man making a calculation. What could be salvaged, what it would cost to speak, what it would cost not to. Thomas Reed was not a stupid man. He understood the room. "I owe Miss Ashcroft an apology," he said. His voice was flat, not warm, the voice of a man doing a necessary thing rather than a desired one. "I encouraged this board to take that letter seriously. I did so for reasons that were not entirely about community welfare." He stopped. That was all he was going to give, and everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant, and he knew they did. He sat back down. It was the most honest thing Thomas Reed had said in 3 months, and it cost him visibly, and Elias found, to his own slight surprise, that he didn't feel anything triumphant about watching it. He just felt tired of the whole business, in the way you feel tired of something that should never have been necessary. Pete Greer looked at the letter on the table in front of him. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked at Vivian. "The board considers this matter closed," he said. "Miss Ashcroft, we appreciate your candor." It was not an apology. It was the closest Pete Greer was going to come to one, and Vivian accepted it with a single nod and nothing else, because she had learned a long time ago that demanding more than people were capable of giving was its own kind of waste. The meeting ended. People filed out into the cold February night. Elias stayed in his seat until the room had mostly cleared and then stood up, and Vivian was still at the front, packing her bag with the letter from Harold Breen and the student progress document, and she did it with the careful movements of a person who is very tired and holding themselves together through the simple discipline of keeping their hands busy. He walked to the front of the room. She looked up at him. "You had that letter from Harold Breen the whole time," he said. "Since December," she said. "He sent it after he heard I'd gotten a position. You've been carrying it for 2 months. Waiting to need it," she said. She closed the bag. "I've learned to keep documentation." He stood there looking at her, and she looked back at him, and there was something between them in that moment that didn't need to be named because it already was what it was. The specific understanding of two people who have been through something together and come out on the other side of it, still standing and still facing the same direction. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "The room full of people tonight." She paused. "That was you." Frank Aldrich made his own decision about coming. "You told them about the meeting." He didn't deny it. "I told them what was happening. What they decided to do with that was their own business." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had seen before, but that was more open now, less defended, the way a door is different when it has been used regularly and the hinges have loosened slightly with use. "I'm not good at this," she said quietly. "I know. I mean the receiving part. Someone being..." She stopped, tried again. It's harder than the fighting I know how to do. I know that too, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to need you to be patient with me for a very long time. He considered that seriously, the way she always wanted him to consider things. I've been patient for 5 months, he said. I think I have the hang of it. She picked up her bag. She looked at the empty room, the chairs, the table where Gerald's letter had been read, the space where the last 6 months of her life in Ridge Hollow had been compressed into a single evening and come out intact. Then she walked past Elias toward the door and paused beside him and said, without looking at him, "Walk me home." He walked her home. They didn't talk much on the short distance between the town hall and the schoolhouse. The cold had deepened with the evening, and their breath came visible in the air, and the stars were out in the clear, undramatic way they were out in Wyoming, which was to say completely, with no competing light to diminish them. At the schoolhouse door she stopped. "I don't not want this," she said, the same word she'd used at the creek, in February's ice light, but differently, without the careful qualification, without the armoring of the double negative, said plainly this time, like a woman who has stopped hedging. He understood the difference. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it clearer this time." "I heard it." She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in her face that was as close to unguarded as he had ever seen it. Not soft. She wasn't a soft person, and she wasn't going to become one. But present. Fully present, without the layered distance she used to manage the world. "Good night, Elias," she said. "Good night, Vivian." She went inside. The lamp came on above. He stood in the cold for a moment looking at it, and then he went home. Spring did not arrive romantically. It arrived the way Wyoming spring always arrives, in fits and arguments with winter, 3 warm days followed by a late frost, mud season that turned every road into something treacherous and unreliable, the creek flooding its banks for a week and then pulling back. The valley looked less like renewal and more like a place in the middle of a long negotiation. But the aspens along the creek started to show green, and the light in the evenings lasted longer. And the children in Vivian's classroom started coming in without their heavy coats, and the youngest ones began eating their lunches on the schoolhouse steps when the sun was warm enough, which it was, some days. She and Elias had been spending Saturday afternoons together since February, riding, sometimes talking, sometimes not. He had met her threshold for patience, and she was slowly, in her way, meeting his threshold for honesty. She had told him about Ohio, about the 4 years with Gerald, about the specific loneliness of being a woman who thinks clearly in a world that finds that inconvenient. He had told her things he hadn't told anyone, about the years after his father died, about the failure with the first cattle season that he'd covered up for 2 years by working himself to the bone and not asking for help, about the particular pride that masquerades as self-sufficiency until it isolates you entirely. They were, neither of them, easy people. They both knew this about each other now, and it was a different kind of knowledge than attraction or admiration. It was the ground-level knowledge of a person's actual shape, the dimensions of who they really were when they weren't managing an impression. It was the 3rd Saturday in April when Elias stopped his horse at the top of the hill above the creek and said, "I have something to ask you." Vivian pulled up beside him. She looked at the valley below, green now in a patchy, uncertain way, the creek silver in the afternoon light. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had thought about how to say this and had decided against preparation because preparation made things false, and he didn't want to be false with her about anything. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "I mean that in the plainest way I can say it. Not a romantic notion, a life, the actual daily work of it, the hard parts and the boring parts and the parts where we disagree and figure it out. I want that with you." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me." Vivian sat on her horse and looked at the valley for a long time. He waited. He had learned to wait. "I'm 41 years old," she said. "Yes." "You're 27. "I'm aware." "People will talk about it for the rest of our lives." "They already have," he said. "It hasn't killed either of us yet." Something in her jaw shifted. "I can't promise you I'll be easy." "I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for honest." "I don't know how to do this without being afraid of it," she said. "Every time I think I'm ready for something like this, I remember Kansas, and I remember what it cost me, and—" "Vivian." He said her name quietly, not cutting her off but placing a point in the stream of words where she could stop if she chose to. I know what it cost you. I've been watching what it cost you for 7 months. I'm not Gerald Ashcroft. I know you know that. I know that doesn't make the fear go away, but I'm asking you to choose what you know over what you're afraid of, just once, and then we'll build from there. She turned and looked at him directly. The wind moved her hair and she didn't put a hand up to manage it, which she usually did. She just sat there and let herself be seen for a moment without adjustment. Yes, she said, simply, without preamble or qualification, just yes. He exhaled. They sat on their horses on that hillside for another few minutes without saying anything more, looking at the valley below them, the muddy green imperfect spring of it, and neither of them pretended it was more than what it was, which was two people who had fought through a hard winter together and decided that was a reasonable basis for a life. The wedding was in June. It was not a large affair. Vivian did not want large. Large meant performance, and performance was something she had excised from her life, along with a number of other things she'd decided were not worth their cost. They were married in the afternoon, in the valley below the creek bend, by a justice of the peace who drove up from the county seat and seemed vaguely baffled by the lack of a church, but conducted the ceremony with professional adequacy regardless. The people who came were the people who had shown up when it mattered. Frank Aldrich and his wife and 3 children. Carl Johnson, who stood in the back and did not cry but came close, which for Carl was essentially the same thing. Nora Clement, who had brought food because she always brought food, and it was always the right amount. Bobby Whitfield, in a coat that was slightly too small for him because he'd grown 3 inches since October, standing with his mother and looking at the whole thing with the expression of a 15-year-old who has decided to pretend he is not moved. Nora's husband, the Whitfield family, a handful of ranch families, old Cal Hennessy, walking carefully on a back that was better but not right. Thomas Reed did not come. Nobody expected him to. Martha Greer did not come. Pete Greer came briefly, awkwardly, and shook Elias's hand and said congratulations in the voice of a man who is doing the right thing because he has finally recognized which direction right is. And Elias thanked him without irony because it was enough. Vivian wore a dress that was dark blue, not white. She was 41 years old and twice through enough to know that white was a convention she had no particular attachment to. And she carried no flowers because she found carrying flowers while trying to say important things to be logistically inconvenient. When they reached the part where they exchanged what they'd chosen to say, instead of formal vows, because Vivian had said she would rather say something true than something traditional, Elias said, "I'm going to be on your road. Whatever that means on any given day. That's what I've got." Vivian looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to stay. I haven't been good at that before. I intend to be good at it now." That was all. It was enough. Bobby Whitfield in the back looked at the sky. What followed was not a perfect marriage. That is worth saying plainly, because the story could pretend it was, and be a more comfortable thing, but it wouldn't be true, and the truth is what Vivian had always insisted on, and Elias had learned to honor. They disagreed regularly about things large and small. Vivian had opinions about ranch management that Elias did not always share, and she expressed them without particularly caring whether he was ready to hear them. Elias had a stubbornness about asking for help that she recognized from her own history and called out with a directness that annoyed him more than he ever admitted. She went quiet for days sometimes, internal, managing something she wasn't ready to share, and he had to learn to not take that personally, which took years rather than months. She did not warm up to the town completely, and the town did not completely warm up to her, and both of those things were fine. What she earned, slowly, imperfectly, through the accumulating evidence of what she actually did, rather than what people had decided she was respect. Not affection from everyone, not universal welcome. Just respect, the earned kind, which is the only kind that lasts. Bobby Whitfield went on to teach at a school in Cheyenne 12 years later, which neither of them expected. He came back to Ridge Hollow the summer before he left, and sat in the classroom where Vivian had first made him read a full page without stopping, and he said he just wanted to come back and see it. She asked if he had any final questions about the material. He laughed for the first time since he was 8 years old, and she almost did too. The ranch grew. The school grew. The valley around them changed in the way valleys change. One family at a time, one hard winter at a time, one drought and flood and difficult season at a time. Elias's land became known as a place you could come to when something went wrong and find help without being made to feel the weight of it. Vivian's classroom produced children who left Ridge Hollow and went places no one in the valley had gone before, not because she had told them they could, but because she had shown them what it looked like to simply refuse to be stopped. She was 63 when the new school board, made up entirely of people whose children she had taught, voted to name the schoolhouse after her. She said she found the gesture premature since she was still using the building, and they said they were naming it anyway, and she told them they were being foolish, and they said they knew. Elias was 49. He sat in the back of the meeting when they announced it, in the same left side seat where he'd sat the night Gerald Ashcroft's letter had been read. And he watched his wife's face do the thing it did when she was receiving something she didn't know how to hold, the slight tension in her jaw, the composure she maintained with the effort of long practice, and underneath it the unmistakable evidence that it had reached her anyway. After the meeting, walking home in the summer evening, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "It's a very small building to put a name on." "It's held a lot of people," he said. She was quiet for another moment, then, "I used to think that making it alone meant you were strong, that needing things from people was the weakness." "I know," he said. "I was wrong about that." "I know that too." She walked beside him, and the evening was warm and the aspens along the creek had their full summer leaves. The valley was green in the deep, certain way it only gets in July, when the season has committed. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad you were on the road." He looked at her. She was looking ahead, not at him, with the profile he knew better than any landscape he'd ever worked, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head, the slight forward angle she always walked at, as if she was perpetually arriving at something. "So am I," he said. They walked home in the last of the light, two people who had not been easy or perfect or without damage, who had made a life not from what the world expected of them, but from what they had chosen to expect of each other. And the valley held them the way places hold the people who have worked them and loved them and stayed, completely, without ceremony, as if they had always belonged there. And maybe they had.